How do you describe the narration of the Serbian-controlled media, who speaks the same propaganda language as Moscow?
I think in the media environment in Serbia with respect to Russian influence, there had been Sputnik Serbia that was available in Serbia, but I don't think that the propaganda of Russia is even is really not that pertinent, only in that they are very much aligned. Up until very recently, Serbia and Russia are basically echoing one another. They're like mirrors of each other. And that has infiltrated their media environment. And it also goes into the RS in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as a matter of fact. So it's not just Serbia that's being quote unquote influenced by Russia, but it's also happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, but what I would say is that the tabloids, basically repeat this stuff, and they talk about Russia, quite frequently. And if you look at any public opinion polling on Serbia, you will see that the most popular country outside of Serbia, besides, loving their own country, the most popular country within the population of Serbia is Russia, and has been for many, many years. And Putin has visited, and Vucic talks about Russia up until this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Mr. Vucic was very, very freely associating with Russia, buying their weapons, meeting with the Russians, meeting with Putin. So, there's really been no reason to need even Russian propaganda in Serbia. Serbia does it for them.
To clarify its Western path, does Serbia need to fully adapt to Western policies?
I think right now the question of where Serbia sits on the issue of Russia in Europe is he's probably feeling a lot of pressure. I mean, I just read the interview that Chris Hill gave, the new U.S. ambassador to Serbia, gave to Radio Free Europe. And, it's really up to Serbia which way they go. But Serbia is geographically located in Europe. And all the countries around Serbia are supporting the sanctions on Russia, including Hungary, which is much as an illiberal state as Serbia is. So if you're surrounded by all these European countries and you have been allegedly seeking to join the EU, you've got to be feeling some pressure given the extraordinary invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And not only is it extraordinary, it's been a war crime from day one. And so I think that perhaps Alexander Vucic was not prepared for a response by the European continent to condemn Russia, just full on, right out. The actions of the Russian military has been characterized by indiscriminate attacks on civilians, killing civilians, raping civilians, and there's nary a military target in sight. They're just killing civilians at will, and it's one more crime after another. And so he's got to be feeling some pressure. And given that we just talked about the media environment, you're starting to see a shift in the media environment where the tabloids have been condemning Russia to a certain extent, and even the state-controlled media has not been espousing, these glowing reports of brotherhood between Slavic brotherhood between Serbia and Russia now. So I think that there are people inside the Serbian government that are probably talking to the media, and they're starting to move a bit away from their full embrace of Russia. And there's also a lot of discussion going on in the media. Will Vucic be able to get out of this situation? And the situation is that he has been sitting on two stools. That's the common expression in Serbia. Is he with Russia or is he with the European Union? And I would say it's a three-legged stool. Where is he standing between Russia, Moscow, Brussels, and Washington? And Washington has sent probably the most experienced living Balkan ambassador to Belgrade, and it just assumed his post late last month. And he's being very clear that Serbia shouldn't be buying equipment from one army, for example, from Russia and China. If you're going to develop a really effective, coordinated security structure, you should really be buying, equipment from one country, more or less, or with the NATO allies, for example. But that's more of an outpicturing of where do they stand. Are they going to be in the West, or is he going to continue to align himself with Russia, which is now, for all practical purposes, a pariah state? And it's more than likely, in my view, that Mr. Vucic will probably never travel beyond Russia, except for this G20 meeting. I suppose the Europeans are hoping maybe if he comes to the G20, they'll be able to talk some sense into him about stopping this war. But it does not seem that he has any inclination to stop this war. And it does not benefit Serbia to be closely aligned with Russia in this moment. So it's really a question of which way does this new government go in Serbia? And he's got to deal with the opposition to his right. And there's really not much of an opposition to the left. And who becomes prime minister will also really probably reflect some of this direction. But it's like, we're all trying to read the cards. Which cards is Mr. Vucic going to lay down on the table?
How do you see the role of the United States of America in the Balkans crisis?
With respect to the United States, in Mr. Hill's first interview, he was very clear that Russia was not going to be any help to Serbia on resolving the relationship with Kosovo. He flat out said that's not going to work. You can see what Russia does. Russia attacks, and they actually commit violence. They use violence, and they've done this in Georgia. They did it in Syria. They then annexed Crimea in 2014, and now they've resumed a hot war in Ukraine itself. So he's making the point that Serbia should not be turning to Russia for help on Kosovo. And as a matter of fact, the kind of help that Russia has provided to Serbia is blocking Kosovo from all international organizations such as the UN. They've been blocked at the OSCE. If Kosovo is going to have a future, Kosovo deserves to be integrated into the international framework, and they should be allowed to join international organizations. So I think that this is not going, it'll be interesting to see how Ambassador Hill negotiates this relationship with Mr. Vucic, but I think he will be an articulate spokesman. Mr. Hill will be an articulate spokesman for US values, which align with Brussels. And if you're deviating from those values, what kind of life are you creating for people in your own country and with your neighbors, as in Kosovo?
Do you think that the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue will end? And how do you see this ending?
Well, this has been going on for such a long time, and I know that there's a meeting on the 13th this month to discuss license plates. It's kind of a back to the future experience for me, because I was in Bosnia when we were negotiating license plates between the political entities. The fact that they used the license plates, Serbia reacted with escalating violence, last year regarding the border situation, and Kosovo removed the license plates, as has happened inside Serbia when people drive into Serbia from Kosovo. So that escalated into, not only a border standoff, but actually they put aircraft in the air. Serbia did. I don't see, Mr. Lajak has yet to really forge a solid negotiating strategy that is delivered on resolving this dispute. Now, the parties have to want to resolve the dispute. And Mr. Kurti has been really clear, we're going to be treated with respect, and we are an equal player. Don't make us a sideshow or insult us. And I'm not sure Mr. Lajak, as some of my colleagues at the Democratization Policy Council, they have said clearly that Mr. Lajak is really not the right person for this negotiation. And the EU in general really hasn't moved this dialogue forward. And I think that, the United States has been trying to be supportive of this. And now with Mr. Hill in Belgrade, it'll be interesting to see if he can be of any help as well. But right now, it just has really been at a standstill. And let's see what happens on the 13th. But given the track record by Mr. Lajak and the history of this process, I don't have right now a lot of confidence that it's going to be resolved in a manner that's going to allow Kosovo and Serbia to coexist in peace. This is deeply troubling to see how I think the EU has not really managed this process well. But again, Serbia has to be acting in good faith, as does Kosovo. And those parties have to agree, when you're making quote unquote peace, you're not making peace with your friends, you're making peace with your enemies.
How much has the Ukraine crisis affected the Balkans in terms of security?
I think that this war has sent fear through, I think, particularly I was just in Sarajevo last month. Actually, I'm sorry, I was in Sarajevo in March, and I have talked to my friends, my Kosovar friends, and of course this evokes memories of their wars, their respective wars. And I think that people are quite jittery. You know, for example, in Bosnia, on the first day of the war between with Russia in Ukraine, the EU sent 500 new soldiers to reinforce EUFOR. And I'm sure that Kosovo feels good about having a NATO contingent within their borders. The best thing I could say, here's an advantage. I will say this about the situation in Ukraine. It's very clear now that Russia's not going to be able to get to the Balkans through any kind of air travel. In other words, they're not going to be able to fly military aircraft through EU airspace. It's going to be shut down for them. And so I see actually a less of a threat now due to this Ukraine war, believe it or not. I think that right now Serbia is being very careful about what they're saying, how they're acting. Russia's not going to be able to be an active threat in military terms right now to the region. Even Hungary has sort of stayed within the lines of a decorum. They're not threatening other countries as well. And there's kind of like, that's one of the benefits of this. And I do think it's very clear now that in terms of Russia acting in a corrosive manner towards Bosnia, in particular, they've been threatening them quite a bit. And while I was in Sarajevo, the war was happening, and the Russian ambassador threatened Bosnia again and said, you know, how if you think you're going to join NATO, you can do that, but we will react, and just look at Ukraine as an example. So that's kind of some saber rattling, but they're operationally not going to be able to do it. And it also, the behavior of Russia in Ukraine does affirm the threat that Russia poses to small countries like Kosovo and Bosnia, in theory. So this war could, as I think it's actually working in a way that is suppressing an active hostility, maybe emanating from Belgrade and any other potential threats beyond the Balkans. I just think Turkey's also acting in a manner, they're a NATO member, they're trying to help support Ukraine in this instance. And so that's the irony of this war, but I do think it evokes a lot of fear and concern by people living in the Balkans, and people are afraid, and it brings up really bad memories of what's happened during the past 30 years, I think, for both countries, Kosovo and Bosnia.